At a particular time during its development, this tadpole will undergo metamorphosis to become a frog. These physical changes are controlled by chemical signals in the frog's body called hormones. The chemical signal for the metamorphosis of the tadpole is thyroxine, a hormone produced by the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland develops as the tadpole matures. The developing thyroid gland gradually produces more thyroxine, which leads to metamorphosis. Just like in a tadpole, some aspects of our development are regulated by hormones. But hormones also have other functions. In order for our body to function properly, it has to respond to continuous signals from the internal and external environments. One way the functions of our body are regulated is through hormones. Hormones are produced and secreted by endocrine glands. Endocrine glands secrete hormones directly into body fluids such as the blood. A hormone travels through the body, but only target cells with receptors for the hormone will respond to the signal. In this picture presentation, we'll look at the endocrine glands of vertebrates. We'll examine the hypothalamus and see how it functions in concert with the pituitary gland. Then we'll introduce the hormone products of the thyroid gland, the pancreas, the adrenal glands, and the gonads. In order for our body to function properly, it has to respond to external stimuli and internal signals. Some are nerve signals, while others are chemical signals. The hypothalamus, a region of the brain, serves as the main integrator of these signals. It receives signals and responds by producing hormones. Many of these hormones regulate the synthesis and secretion of hormones by the glands of the endocrine system. Hormones produced by the hypothalamus are released into the pituitary gland, located at the base of the hypothalamus. The pituitary gland has two distinct parts, the anterior pituitary and the posterior pituitary. Some hormones from the hypothalamus are secreted into the blood. This is the job of the posterior pituitary gland. Other hypothalamic hormones control the production and release of hormones from the anterior pituitary gland. The hypothalamus synthesizes several hormones that are secreted into the blood via the posterior pituitary gland. Oxytocin is produced and released in females in response to suckling or breastfeeding. Suckling stimulates nerves that send signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus synthesizes oxytocin, which is released from the posterior pituitary gland. When the oxytocin reaches the mammary gland, the breast, it signals the breast to eject milk. During childbirth, the release of oxytocin causes the muscles of the uterus to contract. One hormone can have various effects. This is due in part to different target cells expressing the hormone receptor on their surface only under particular conditions, so they respond to the hormone only at certain times. Antidiuretic hormone, or ADH, is also produced by the hypothalamus and released by the posterior pituitary gland. ADH helps control the concentration of solutes in the blood. When the concentration of solutes is too high, nerve cells in the hypothalamus signal to secretory cells in the hypothalamus to synthesize ADH. When the ADH, released by the posterior pituitary, reaches the kidney, it signals target cells to release water into the blood to lower the solute concentration. The solute concentration is lowered, and the nerve cells stop signaling the production of ADH. This type of negative feedback is common in maintaining homeostasis. Unlike the posterior pituitary, the anterior pituitary doesn't release hormones produced by the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary is made up of endocrine cells that synthesize and secrete hormones into the blood under the control of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces and releases two classes of hormones into the blood supply of the anterior pituitary: releasing hormones and inhibiting hormones. Releasing hormones cause the anterior pituitary to secrete particular hormones. Inhibiting hormones make it stop secreting particular hormones. Each anterior pituitary hormone is controlled by at least one releasing hormone, and some hormones are controlled by both releasing and inhibiting hormones. Some anterior pituitary hormones are tropic, meaning they cause the synthesis and secretion of hormones by other endocrine glands. For example, the anterior pituitary gland secretes several hormones, including follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, and luteinizing hormone, or LH, which stimulate activities of the male and female gonads. The anterior pituitary secretes some non-tropic hormones that directly affect the target tissue, including endorphins, which inhibit the perception of pain by the brain. Some of the secreted hormones are both tropic and non-tropic. Growth hormone, or GH, is tropic because it promotes the production of growth factors, such as insulin-like growth factor, by the liver. Growth hormone also directly stimulates the growth of bones. Now that we've explored the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland, let's consider the hormone products of some other endocrine glands and see how they interact with the hypothalamus. Continuing our investigation of the endocrine glands, we'll look at the thyroid gland. In mammals, the thyroid is composed of two lobes on the ventral, or front side, of the trachea. The thyroid produces two structurally similar hormones: triiodothyronine, or T3, and thyroxine, or T4. T3 has 3 iodine atoms, and T4 has 4. These hormones are derived from the amino acid tyrosine. T3 and T4 both have the same effect on their target cells. T3 and T4 production by the thyroid is controlled by the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus produces a releasing hormone that causes the production and secretion of thyroid-stimulating hormone, or TSH, by the anterior pituitary. TSH binds to receptors in the thyroid, triggering the synthesis and secretion of T3 and T4. The production of the releasing hormone in the hypothalamus is regulated by the levels of T3, T4, and TSH in the blood. Low levels of these hormones trigger the production of the releasing hormone, and high levels inhibit production. The proper regulation of T3 and T4 levels in our blood is important for good health. These hormones are involved in regulating such essential functions as blood pressure, heart rate, digestion, and reproduction. The hormones increase the rate of oxygen consumption and cellular metabolism. Too much of the thyroid hormones leads to a condition called hyperthyroidism, which is characterized by high body temperature, sweating, high blood pressure, and weight loss. Too little of the thyroid hormones causes hypothyroidism, and its symptoms include weight gain, fatigue, and intolerance to cold. The thyroid gland also helps regulate the level of calcium in our blood. Calcium homeostasis is also regulated by the 4 parathyroid glands embedded in the surface of the thyroid gland. The regulation of blood calcium levels is a good example of how 2 antagonistic hormones work together to maintain homeostasis. When the blood calcium level is too low, the parathyroid glands secrete parathyroid hormone, or PTH. This raises the blood calcium level by stimulating the bones to release calcium, and by increasing calcium uptake by the kidneys. When the blood calcium level is too high, the thyroid gland secretes the hormone calcitonin. This lowers the blood calcium level by stimulating calcium to be deposited in bones and by reducing calcium uptake in the kidneys. The regulation of blood calcium levels shows how 2 hormones work antagonistically to maintain homeostasis. In a similar way, blood glucose levels are regulated by 2 hormones produced by another endocrine gland, the pancreas. The pancreas is located between the stomach and the intestines. Most pancreatic cells produce digestive enzymes that are released into the small intestine through the pancreatic duct. A small number of pancreatic cells are endocrine cells. Clusters of endocrine cells scattered throughout the pancreas are called islets of Langerhans. Each islet is composed of 2 types of endocrine cells, alpha cells and beta cells. Alpha cells secrete the hormone glucagon. Beta cells secrete the hormone insulin. Glucagon and insulin are antagonistic hormones that regulate the level of glucose in the blood. When blood glucose levels are low, alpha cells produce glucagon. Glucagon signals the liver to break down stored glycogen, releasing glucose into the blood. When blood glucose levels are high, beta cells produce insulin. Insulin signals the liver to take up glucose and store it as glycogen. It also signals body cells to take up more glucose. Proper regulation of blood glucose levels is important because glucose is the main fuel for cellular respiration. When glucose homeostasis fails, the resulting condition is called diabetes mellitus. Type 1 diabetes mellitus is also known as insulin-dependent diabetes. It is an autoimmune disease caused by the immune system attacking the beta cells. Once the beta cells are destroyed, no insulin is produced, and the body can't respond when the blood glucose level becomes too high. This type of diabetes generally appears suddenly during childhood. People with type 1 diabetes must have insulin injections to keep their blood glucose level under control. Type 2 diabetes mellitus is non-insulin dependent diabetes. In some patients, and insulin deficiency results from reduced insulin production by their beta cells, a problem similar to type 1 diabetes. But for most people with type 2 diabetes, a change in the insulin receptors on their target cells causes them to have a reduced responsiveness to the hormone. The overall result is the same. The target cells don't get the signal that the glucose level is too high. Type 2 diabetes generally appears after age 40. The disease is associated with obesity and aging, and is highly dependent on a person's lifestyle. Many type 2 diabetics manage their blood glucose levels through a healthy diet and exercise. In our investigation of the thyroid gland and pancreas, we saw how antagonistic hormones maintain homeostasis. Now let's look at an endocrine gland involved in the stress response. Located on top of the kidneys, our adrenal glands help us respond to physical and emotional stresses. In mammals, each adrenal gland is made up of two distinct regions that are actually different glands. The outer region is the adrenal cortex, and the inner region is the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla responds to nerve signals. In stressful conditions, nerve cells in the hypothalamus are stimulated. Via the sympathetic nervous system, they signal the cells of the adrenal medulla to release the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine. Epinephrine is also known as adrenaline. These hormones trigger the fight or flight response, the way you react to stressful situations. The release of epinephrine and norepinephrine gives your body a quick boost of energy. To provide extra fuel, they signal your liver to increase the breakdown of glycogen to glucose and stimulate fat cells to release fatty acids. They also increase your heart rate and the volume of blood pumped by each beat. They increase oxygen delivery by dilating the bronchioles in the lungs. While the adrenal medulla responds to nerve signals, the adrenal cortex responds to endocrine signals from the hypothalamus. During a stressful situation, the hypothalamus produces releasing hormones that stimulate the anterior pituitary to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. As the name suggests, ACTH is a tropic hormone. When it reaches the target cells of the adrenal cortex, it stimulates them to produce and release a group of hormones called corticosteroids. One type of corticosteroid is the glucocorticoids. They affect glucose metabolism by increasing the effects of glucagon produced by the pancreas. More glucose is released, thereby giving the body extra fuel. Glucocorticoids also suppress the immune system. This helps explain why people who are under stress for a long time are at risk of becoming sick. Another type of corticosteroid is the mineralocorticoids. They affect the blood salt and water balance. They stimulate cells of the kidneys to retain sodium ions and water instead of excreting them. This helps increase the overall blood volume of the body, which in turn raises the blood pressure. The last group of hormones we'll look at are a different type of steroid produced by the gonads. The male gonads are the testes, and the female gonads are the ovaries. The gonads are the endocrine glands that produce the sex hormones, which are steroids. The testes synthesize mostly androgens, the male sex hormones. Testosterone is the main androgen. Androgens produced early in development are what cause an embryo to develop into a male. During puberty, androgens are involved in the development and maintenance of male secondary sex characteristics, including hair growth patterns and a low voice. The ovaries produce mainly estrogens and progestins, the female sex hormones. The role of estrogen during puberty in females is equivalent to the role of androgens in males. Progestins are required to prepare and maintain the uterus for pregnancy. For our body to function properly, it has to constantly respond to both internal and external signals. To survive, we have to process chemical and nerve signals. One way our body responds to these signals is by producing chemical signals called hormones. A hormone is produced by an endocrine gland and secreted directly into the blood or other body fluids. The hormone travels through the body, and its signal is received by target cells, which respond to the signal. In order for the body to respond to many different chemical and nerve signals, one main integrator coordinates many of the signals between the endocrine and nervous systems. This is the job of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus receives chemical and nerve signals and responds via the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is composed of the anterior and posterior pituitary glands. The posterior pituitary secretes two hormones produced by the hypothalamus. The anterior pituitary produces and secretes many hormones under the control of the hypothalamus. Many of the hormones produced by the hypothalamus or anterior pituitary gland help regulate other endocrine organs. Negative feedback loops are often used to regulate hormone production. Some endocrine organs function to maintain homeostasis. Homeostasis is generally regulated by two antagonistic hormones. Blood calcium and glucose levels are regulated in this way. Not all endocrine organs are solely devoted to maintaining homeostasis. Our adrenal glands help us respond to stress. The adrenal gland is composed of an outer region called the adrenal cortex and an inner region called the adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla responds to nerve signals originating from the hypothalamus. The adrenal cortex responds to endocrine signals from the hypothalamus via the anterior pituitary. The gonads produce the sex hormones. The main male sex hormones are androgens. The main female sex hormones are estrogens. Females also produce progestins to prepare and maintain the uterus for pregnancy. We've looked at only a few of the hormones that scientists have identified. Scientists are continuing to study how hormones function to control development, homeostasis, and many other important biological processes. As we learn more about how our body functions, we can use the information to maintain good health. Understanding blood glucose homeostasis helps doctors treat patients with diabetes. With continued medical research, doctors may someday be able to treat other diseases whose causes are not well understood today.